All right, good afternoon. My name is Nick Vinocour. I'm editor-at-large and co-author of Brussels Playbook, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk about AI and democracy, subject at the intersection of politics and technology. I used to be Politico's technology editor, so some of this is still familiar to me. You're watching Politico Live, the live extension of Politico's non-partisan journalism, and today we're live from ACE events, just a stone's throw away from the European Commission. What are we talking about today? With the US election around the corner, we'll be asking our panel, what is the state of play with misinformation on the platforms today? Is AI helping to spread misinformation? And how responsive are the platforms to requests to take down examples of misinformation? And what about Europe's Digital Services Act, its big law meant to regulate content? How is that performing so far? We'll be discussing this and much more with our panelists today. Before we go any further, I have a couple of housekeeping remarks. I'd like to thank our partner, Luminate, for making this event possible, and thank our audience for joining us online and here in the room with us at ACE. Here at Politico, we like to make our events as interactive as possible. So you can participate by tweeting about it at Live Politico and asking questions through the Slido app using the hashtag democracy and AI. You know who we are, so I will prioritize questions that have a name and an organization attached to them. Now let's break the ice. You can already participate by answering the following question. With the rise of deep fakes threatening election integrity, what is the most effective strategy to counter their spread? This is on the Slido app. And we will look at the results and read them out at the end of the panel. We will now hear some opening remarks from our partner, Guillermo Beltra, Policy Director at Luminate Strategic Initiatives. Come up on stage, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today in person, but also to all of those of you who are following online. We're really pleased to welcome you today. Luminate is a foundation that works at the intersection of human rights, social justice in the digital age with a focus on marginalized communities and people. And today, as Nick just explained, we're going to talk about something that's really big. How does AI impact our democracy? It's a complex topic and it's fast evolving, especially in the context of elections. We're very happy to have allied with Politico on this, not just to put together this event, but also to sponsor a series in their newsroom called Bots and Ballots, which we would encourage you all to go check online. I'm excited about the panel of experts that we're going to hear from in a little bit, but first I want to leave you with a few high-level, I was calling them reflections, but I'm going to call them provocations. The first one is that as we hear about all of these topics, in our analysis, we operate in an accountability vacuum. Despite scores of market and economic regulation, human rights-based laws, and other attempts at governing the digital space, I don't think we can say that the AI systems and companies that we see put their services deep within our democracies are accountable to our democratic institutions. Challenge me if you disagree with that. I think that's a key question for us today. The second important reflection or provocation that I will share today is that civil society has to be part of the solution. The EU and any other institution inside the regulatory ecosystem needs not only watchdogs to look after the work that they're doing, but especially they need technical experts that work in the public interest. And this is key in the public interest, because we will see a lot of technical experts whose interest are the quarterly results of big technological companies. But we need the technical experts that work in that public interest. Now, we're seeing a political priority agenda for the new commission that is focused a lot on competitiveness and security and growth. But let's be true, let's be real. Like, growth for the sake of growth will not generate social justice. We really need this focus on what is the public's interest. And we need to remember the lessons of the past, of so many other industries leading the policy and the public agenda. And to know a bit more about what civil society broadly thinks should be the priorities of this new mandate, I would invite you to take a look at the Tech and Society Summit that happened 2 weeks ago on the 1st of October. This was a coalition of over 40 civil society organizations that did an event that was the first of its kind. One of them was CDT Europe, from whom we will hear a little bit more today. And the third broader message I wanted to leave you with today is that we're going to hear a lot about disinfo, and that's great. And disinfo plays a very important role in what we're discussing. But let's not forget that this is not only about content. This is ultimately a question about power. It's a question about power within the market and the gigantic imbalance that there is between a handful of big tech companies and the rest of the market. It is a question of imbalance of power between those companies and the institutions that are meant to oversee them. And most importantly, from our perspective, and this is what we're trying to solve, is a gigantic imbalance between the companies, the institutions, and the civil society organizations that are trying very hard to make the world fairer. Now, we would love, and I would encourage the speakers to add their thoughts about this as well, the EU regulatory ecosystem to be bold and imaginative. There are new and old tools in the book. We're going to hear about the DSA, but there's also the Digital Markets Act. There will be soon the Artificial Intelligence Act, and a suite of other laws, including competition law, that must be used together here. And thirdly, we need the EU to walk the talk. The EU likes to be perceived as the jurisdiction globally where all of its action is based on fundamental rights. And it is trying to be the global regulator in this space. The world is watching, and for that we need Global South, particularly Global South voices, those that are the most impacted by these technologies, to participate in the conversations that we're having in Europe. And we need all of that to work together so that we're maximizing the positive impact that the EU is having around the world through its action in the tech space. Thank you very much for joining. I really look forward for the conversation. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you for your insights, your provocations, Guillermo. Now let's get right into our panel. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and you can join me up on stage as I call out your name. Starting with Christina Stump, who's head of unit Media Convergence and Social Media at DG Connect in the European Commission. Not a very far commute for you today. Baibars Orsek, Vice President of Fact Checking at Logically. Welcome. Maria Donde, Director of International Affairs at Commission Naman. That's how I was told to pronounce it. Elza Pilichowski, Director for Public Governance at the OECD, and last but not least, Asha Allen, Secretary General at the Center for Democracy and Technology in Europe. Now, thanks all very much for coming. Let's start right here in our neighborhood with Christina. Could you, we just had a big election here in the European Union, European Parliament elections on June 9th. Maybe since you're observing, could you give us a little bit of insight into what you have observed in that campaign in terms of disinformation, use of AI on platforms? We start there.
Indeed, so we have been looking quite closely at the European parliamentary elections, and we have also, of course, accompanied it through regulatory measures, but now, how did it look like? So first of all, unsurprisingly, the amount of disinformation has increased close to the election, so it actually raised from around 5% of EU-related disinformation to 15% just ahead of the election, so there was a substantial increase. Also, the narratives that were used were the usual narratives regarding the war in Ukraine, instilling fear, also, for example, claiming that EU soldiers are dying on the grounds in Ukraine. Then also anti-migration related narratives, but also disinformation relatives related to climate change or anti-LGBTQ. When it comes at the same time to AI-generated disinformation, where there have been a lot of concerns about deep fakes emerging, about candidates, about important political figures. We have not observed a major disinformation incident, either in general or regarding the use of AI. So this deep fake fear, luckily, did not materialize as such in Europe. At the same time, generative AI has been part of the campaign. For example, several studies have shown how it has been used. So it has been used, for example, as shown by AI forensics in several campaigns, as illustrating narratives, generating pictures, for example, related to EU, anti-EU narratives or anti-migration narratives, these pictures that are depicting migrants in a way that instills fear. So this has been very much part of the campaigns. And of course, that's why, and also in other ways, we have been put several instruments in place to have mitigation measures in this regard.
Yeah, those are pictures of Donald Trump saving cats and things like that. We see a lot on X. We're going to come back to the regulation aspect to it because we do have a law. I want to go to you, Baybars. We also have another big campaign coming up, the U.S. election in just over less than a month now. What are you seeing similar things in the U.S. election? What is the landscape like on platforms right now in terms of misinformation, use of AI? What are your observations?
Well, I guess the U.S. elections just marked the fourth period of platforms' responses to mis and disinformation. I just take it back to early 2010s when the Arab Spring just reminded the platforms how they should be responsible to protecting free speech, enabling the activists, and protecting the integrity of the institutions across the board was the first of a kind of a reminder for those platforms. And with the 2016 elections and then the 2020 with the COVID, I guess this elections is just the history repeating itself. The platforms are just coming into new conclusions that they actually need to be doing much better, working with civil society, working with practitioners, working with fact-checking organizations. But what we don't see is, unfortunately, them learning some lessons from previous elections. We had this 2024 with elections all around the world, with India, with the European Union, then in the UK, and all other countries in Europe. And what we are seeing is now is just a recirculation of the same tactics and tools to spread mis and disinformation. And despite how we were afraid back in early 2024, it was not about all like deep fakes or very advanced tools. It was still about those cheap fakes, those pieces of misinformation that were created using simple tools. And the whole conversation was kind of meaningless to a point where the interventions that the platforms did put together were actually not the cure that the fact checkers that I've been working with for quite a long time were needing for. So the platforms still do a lot in terms of like pre-bunking, media literacy, but that also comes down to the understanding that if they provide high volume of quality information, then the misinformation will just vanish. But that doesn't happen. We put a lot of emphasis on watermarking or labeling. As a tech company, logically, we put this emphasis on connecting that with the human expertise, with the domain expertise, because we believe in the AI is good as the people who train and work it. What is happening right now, I guess, is too much focus is being put on labeling, but we don't necessarily talk a lot about prevention. So many of those social media platforms, namely Meta, TikTok, and some other examples in the mid to large market platforms, they were very reactive with their partners. It's when misinformation takes place, they work with their partners to take it down with their content moderators, but the real harm actually has been made during the time between intervention and discovery and intervention. So as a tech company, we are working through building technology with our partners to find ways in which we can act on the misinformation on this first occurrence and then help the society, the industry at large, to take meaningful actions.
Thanks. And one thing you haven't mentioned is sort of inauthentic activity or just the bots. I want to ask you guys about that after you hear stunning figures about how much of the engagement on some of these platforms is completely fake and might be AI generated. But we'll be able to get back to that. Maria Donde at the Commission Naman, you are already at work implementing the AI Act, moderating online content. Can you tell us a little bit about, as a regulator, how you are equipped to deal with the massive disinformation of AI-generated content? How is that going from a resource perspective? And yeah, open a door on that for us.
Sure. Thank you. And just to clarify, we are not yet implementing the AI Act, and we have been given no powers yet in relation to the AI Act. And indeed, we are also not really responsible at all for content moderation. We are implementing the Digital Services Act, very much in collaboration with the European Commission and other digital service coordinators, other regulators across the EU. And that gives us certain tools. But we are also, and just to kind of give a bit of context, we are, Commission Naman, which you've beautifully pronounced, translates into English as the Irish Media Commission. So we are an organisation that was set up specifically to ensure a trusted, safe, and diverse and pluralistic media landscape in Ireland. And of course, we have responsibilities that will also relate to the wider EU. And so we have a number of different tools in our toolbox related to the prevention of disinformation, however it is generated, whether by humans or machines or a combination of the two. That comes in part from a number of the different provisions of the DSA, but also, for example, the application of the disinformation code by online platforms and signatories. It's also in relation to the guidelines that the European Commission put out ahead of the EU elections. And we have also been involved very much in assessing and analysing the compliance with those guidelines, which draws on the disinformation code and other instruments and of course the DSA. So we have those tools in our box, but we also have, for example, media literacy, which is something that we are very, very active in. And during the last European elections, and we will also apply this for the Irish forthcoming elections, TBC when, we produced, for example, guidance for candidates, as well as going out to the public and ensuring that they were aware of what rights they have in terms of contacting platforms, identifying and helping to deal with the problem of disinformation online. So we have a number of those different tools. I can talk about more of those later, but that's hopefully an introduction to our work in this area.
Yeah, thanks. And I heard you talk about compliance. Very, very curious about that. So we'll come back to it. Elza Pilichowski, Director of Public Governance for the OECD. You are working at this at a higher level for all the OECD countries, working on a watermarking system. Could you bring us up to date on those sort of international dialogues about how we should deal with AI and disinformation? How is that going?
So yes, we're currently working on what we call a standard for information integrity. That is an agreement among 38 countries, 38 governments on how they should handle mis and disinformation through a whole of society approach, through a transparency, accountability of information sources, and also through how governments also should behave in the information ecosystem space. One of the big difficulties that we have had since the beginning, and obviously it's a difficulty for democratic governments, is that governments, for obvious and right reasons, have had to remain at distance from the information ecosystem. And that's right in democratic settings, and we should absolutely make sure that this remains the case. So having a tool that allows governments to help frame integrity around information ecosystem is actually extremely complicated to make sure that it remains compatible with freedom of speech. So now we have found solutions around that. I mean, the Commission has found its own way. We're working with 38 countries and the Commission to come up also with another standard that will be also compatible also obviously with the DSA. This work is improving with time. But just to come back to one issue that tends to be not under enough focus. I mean, there are two ways for AI to to increase the problems with information integrity during elections. One is with the deepfakes, and we all know those. We've all seen deepfakes in the past. And the other one is to allow more micro-targeting and bots. So it's increasing the reach and the speed with which disinformation is shared in 3 areas regarding elections. One is, when are the elections? Where are they? Are they good elections? Is the system fair? And are the results okay? And sometimes you have a lot of disinformation about the process of elections itself, which is a big immediate threat and has already happened in a lot of countries, not a lot, in a few countries. Second is obviously the deepfakes about political platforms. It's about how politicians' platforms, how they behave and what they say. We know that very well. And the third one, which is even more difficult to deal with, is how disinformation enhanced by AI can, slowly, little by little, undermine trust in government as a whole, in public institutions as a whole. And that one is even more worrying because it goes slowly, little by little. And when you see the disinformation crisis around the hurricanes, for example, the hurricanes crisis in the US right now, it's very worrying in the sense that people share this information they know is not true because there's so little trust now in public institutions in our democracies. And that is even more difficult to address today.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Asha Allen, Secretary General for the Center of Democracy and Technology in Europe. We already have some laws on the books here in the EU, in the US, not quite. Are these laws already having an effect and sort of cleaning up the online space? What are your observations about that so far?
Yes, it's a great question. I would say it's slightly early to be able to say, to ascertain whether these laws are going to be effective in essentially addressing some of these issues. And I would like to just touch upon some of the aspects that were mentioned here, because we're talking about the kind of content moderation, the information space, and at the heart of it for civil society organizations like ours, it's the strongest possible protections for fundamental rights within that context. So there are things that are appropriate that regulators should be doing and that platforms should be doing with their due diligence obligations, but understanding how quite an extensive EU legislative framework comes together is yet to be seen. The DSA is in, I would still argue, year 0.1, 0.5 of implementation. The AI Act itself is still very early days. There's a lot of secondary legislation that needs to be put together. And there are different elements that need to come together. The Code of Practice on Disinformation we've had for some time, but this will now become a code of conduct under the DSA. Things will change, and we need to see how that all comes together. I think there are fundamental questions that my co-panelists, and also inspired by our opening words, that need to be addressed here, because I think there is a narrative, of course, around deepfakes and the impact it has on democratic processes. This is not just to say the dissemination, of content, but thinking about how it impacts the right to relevant information when it comes to an election, and how AI technologies are being used in different contexts. And I mean beyond just the malicious actors context in terms of disseminating content. Our colleagues at CDT have done some research looking at how AI chatbots are being used by, say, voters who want to be able to access information on how they can vote in non-standard ways, say voters with disabilities, and how they may do these with absentee voting. But if the information that the AI chatbot provides to them is also incorrect, and this has been put in place by an institution, this is also a problem when it comes to the integrity of elections. And similarly, thinking about how platforms are asked to use increasingly more complex AI models in their automated decision-making and content moderation, we know again from our research that a lot of these automated decision-making models lack nuance, lack context, and it disproportionately impacts those, say, from marginalized communities or in, what they would call minority languages in terms of how those systems are being used. So I think in general, as we're thinking about AI in this democratic context, we have to think about its use by multiple different actors, but also where civil society organizations like CDT come in as those accountability actors to say, a platform is not doing its due diligence obligations under the DSA, which yes, it's an extensive law, but for very large online platforms, we're still relying quite a lot on their due diligence and hoping there isn't a race to the bottom in terms of compliance for abiding by those due diligence obligations. But similarly, how are government institutions using AI when they're moving over to e-governance, and whether that has an issue for democratic oversight as well. So I think there's a lot of different factors that we need to think about when it comes to this in this particular context.
Thanks very much. So let's get right into it. I mean, right now we have the DSA, which is online, and I heard the word compliance used a couple of times. It's already a couple months into it. What are you observing from within the Commission about the behavior of platforms? How are they responding to the DSA in particular, in terms of sharing information, openness about participating and complying with this law?
So what I could say from my perspective is looking mainly into disinformation and election preparations from platform side, that I would say that the strong legislative framework, the Digital Services Act and other instruments put in place have already contributed to some extent to the fact that actually there has been no major disinformation incident during the European Parliament elections. Nevertheless, you can also see that the Commission has not been standing idle. So we have opened investigations. We have also sent requests for information, for example, regarding the so-called hallucinations of chatbots, where, for example, some of the platforms have responded actually by suspending giving answers to election-related requests during the European Parliament elections, which I think is a good immediate result. Then also, what we have been doing, the Code of Practice on Disinformation has been also mentioned. This is a very important cooperation framework, because I believe that it is important that we are accompanying the elections and not just waiting for the disinformation to show up and take action afterwards. So under the code, the signatories, which include major online platforms as well as fact-checkers and civil society organizations, have, for example, put in place a rapid response system where, for example, fact-checkers could flag time-sensitive information that could impact the integrity of elections. And in these cases, platforms have been actually quite fast in responding to this type of actions. I think we have seen responsiveness. Of course, we will not stay idle in the future, and we have a very strong instrument at our disposal.
Okay. Well, just to... one of the investigations that's already open is against X, Elon Musk platform. And we can see there's already been a clash, basically, between the commission formerly in charge of the DSA and Elon Musk. I mean, does that complicate things in terms of regulating disinformation, that some people say, well, you're trying to regulate free speech, and that this has become a very political area now, where content regulation, any type of content regulation, is being compared to censorship and so on. Does that make the Commission's job more difficult?
Thank you so much for this question, because this gives me the opportunity to actually dispel a couple of conceptions about how we are regulating content through the Digital Services Act. So I think it's very important to underline that when it comes to disinformation, which is not illegal content, the idea is not to remove this type of content or to take action against individual cases. What the Digital Services Act is imposing is a risk mitigation obligation for very large online platforms, notably to put in place measures to reduce the spread of disinformation. For example, the industry code, the Code of Practice on Disinformation, has several of such measures, which, for example, are about reducing manipulative behavior, like the use of fake accounts or bots, or to use fact-checking, to give users more information about the content that they are seeing, to apply media literacy measures, and so on. So I believe it's very important to look into these measures, because all of them are fully in line with the freedom of speech as the Digital Services Act. So there is absolutely no contradiction against these two. And of course, in all cases, the Commission is very much ensuring that every action taken is in line with the freedom of speech.
Do you see some of these investigations wrapping up or some action being taken in the near future?
These are ongoing investigations, so of course we will take the next steps when it will be appropriate after analyzing the information received.
Okay. Baibars, in terms of, you've been active in the disinformation space. Has this become a more sort of strained, kind of troubled area since it has become basically the focus of controversy, people saying that it's censorship and so on? Does that make your work more difficult in the fact-checking space? People saying that it's censorship and
to your point, yes. Well, I mean, I might be a bit trained than many others because I started fact-checking in Turkey in early 2010s, and my organization's mandate was to fact-check political claims and hold the PowerPoint account during those years. It wasn't an easy task, and then I was blessed to be able to be the director of the International Fact-Check Network for about 4 years between 2019 and 2023. And during those years, yes, we heard a lot of accusations about our practice being an agent of censorship. And to an extent, this was unfortunately also fueled by the lack of education understanding of the within the platforms who were working with the fact checkers at the time, because whenever they were facing any criticism or whatsoever, they were very eager to put the whole responsibility on the fact checkers. They were like, it's the fact checkers who fact checked, it's them, it's not us. So it was a learning curve for the platforms. It was a learning curve for us, the fact checkers. And then we came to an understanding that we need to communicate much better. We need to help the public to understand what we do. And actually, that was the reason why I left the International Fact-Checking Network and joined Logically, to build meaningful and sustainable solutions to address this problem with speed and scale. Because rather than having this, like a tag game where you constantly try to catch misinformation, and the platforms benefit from your work by either removing that content or putting labels on it. The ways in which that we believe at Logically is to find those solutions that can be scalable, because it's a very it's growingly becoming like an arms race where we fact checkers are trying to find those claims or try to fact check in a content on social media, and then we get all the blame. Now, what we are trying to do within the broader industry is to help the platforms to understand what we actually help them in the discovery part of the problem. We work with those platforms, and thanks to all those regulatory attempts by the European Union, we definitely get much more attention. We now get more platforms, entering this field, launching new programs, and to some, it may look like just a check mark exercise, but especially when you work with them, you understand that they're also trying to figure this out. And with those platforms now entering this space, working with organizations like us and others, our goal is to help them to understand this is not just a labeling problem, this is not just a content moderation problem, it's more about an information quality problem where those platforms can help or empower their users to access accurate and quality information. So the more we switch that proactive intervention, I think we will have to deal less with the censorship accusations. It is still out there in Brazil. A lot of my colleagues are being harassed by the government in different parts of the world. Fact-checking is not an easy job, but the ways in which we help the information ecosystem become healthier, I think we will get to a point where...
How can it be, no, seriously, I mean, how could it be healthier when the owner of one of the most popular platforms is attacking fact-checking, attacking regulation as censorship, and saying that? How are these platforms complying with? Are they putting sufficient resources into complying with fact-checking? Are they putting? And can we put some names on it, because I feel like we're being very polite about how are they performing with regard to one another? Back when I was technology editor, we talked a lot about Meta. Now the discussion is much more about X and TikTok. What does your experience show about how the platforms are responding to these?
Sure.
These things?
More very large online platforms are now taking more active positions in terms of their transparency, their content moderation practices, their partnership with the fact checkers. Meta, for example, is definitely, I mean, not probably, is the oldest social media platform that has had a partnership with the fact checkers since 2016. Then TikTok followed suit by launching their own fact-checking program, and they are actually doing a really good job in terms of what they used to do previously. I mean, I spent, years probably trying to get a piece of transparency from those platforms in the early years, and now they are forced to do that thanks to the pressure that they get from the European Union. Obviously, there are some outliers in this space, and it is definitely posing a challenge on fact checkers trying to deal with the misinformation that happens on various platforms and then jumping onto the other platforms, because misinformation is not a platform-specific problem. It is a universal problem that you see on a specific platform. Let it be like a fringe platform with a lower number of users, but then in a couple of hours or days or weeks, you see that narrative very harmful on other platforms that is too hard to act on. So it is definitely, it takes a village to deal with this problem, and it's always nice to see that the village has new neighbors, but that may not be the case for all the platforms, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask you, Maria, I mean, we've seen that these sort of actors who were often in the newspapers maybe 10 years ago aren't the same ones as today. And in Ireland, you've got a lot of experience with tech companies being based there. Could you tell us a little bit about that, about how some of these companies may have been resistant at first and are now kind of quite compliant and cooperative, and others that may be newer or having a harder time? Could you sort of give us some insight into how the different platforms are behaving with regard to regulation and things like that?
So, I mean, I think I can go back to reflect perhaps something that Ash has said, which is that we are at a very early stage. We are at a very early stage here. It is year zero of the DSA and of the entire
but there's other
online safety regulatory framework.
There's the GDPR has been there for 6 years.
There's all
kinds of tech regulations.
Yes, well, but obviously not an area of our responsibility. But yes, we have seen that to some extent changes in attitudes. We still, I think, expect to see more, and I think there is still, this notion of a culture of compliance, which aligns very much with our approach to supervision and so on and so forth as a regulator that is still very much a work in progress, I would say. We are still in the process of gathering evidence, of trying to understand different approaches that platforms are taking. We are working, again, as I say, with our fellow digital service coordinators and with the European Commission in that effort, because it is it's not a one country approach or solution either. So I think we have seen certainly the one thing I would say is that there's definitely been a willingness to engage with the regulator. We have a very regular set of interactions and engagement with the platforms which are based in Ireland. I think one of the things that's been quite interesting is and we've just launched a series of questions that we've sent out to all platforms, including very large online platforms, but also some of the smaller ones in Ireland, is around some of the really basic fundamental compliance with the DSA type questions, so Articles 12, Article 16, ones which deal with really the most simple, the most kind of basic requirements of the regulatory framework, and the fact that that's where we're starting, I think, indicates that just how long we have to go until we see real change and the real impact of the regulation.
Thanks. I want to look at some of the questions we're getting from the audience already. Thanks for those who are submitting them online. I'm going to take one that is named. Yuri Lienhardt, thanks for your question. As the AI, and I will address this question to you, Asha Allen, as AI is used more and more in creating content that's used to impact election, are there plans to use AI to detect the content and stop it? So basically, can AI be an asset in finding inauthentic activity and disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer this question insofar as the thoughts that civil society has had around the use of AI in the use of detection, so in content moderation mechanisms. Yes, we understand that very large platforms operating at scale due to their due diligence obligations, but also the requirements under the DSA are very likely to use these tools. But again, we would caution against the use of technologies that we still need to have a much better understanding of. I think even just the shape of this conversation can highlight this. I mean, we're having a deep discussion about the impact of generative AI on elections, but there are some researchers who are also questioning whether it is the impact as much as we think it actually is, right? And is it going to have the same impact? And similarly, I think pushing this narrative and the use of AI in the context of, say, content moderation and things may detract from the need for the use of nuance and the complex understanding when it comes to preserving free expression in the online space, which is why there are responsibilities that are appropriate within the legal framework in terms of how things are regulated and other things that should be through due diligence obligations. I think if very large online platforms are going to increasingly use these technologies in their content moderation practices, we need to demand even more increased transparency than what's there in the legal framework. Now, we've talked about how the DSA and other things are in the early days, but we can't negate the fact that the international human rights framework and corporate due diligence has been there for a very long time. And these platforms have had an obligation under that international human rights framework to ensure that their products and services do not undermine any of our rights. So they've actually had a very long time to be in compliance with this. And so now we have this legal framework. I think a concern for civil society organizations is whether they increasingly use these technologies, for example, is have they been sufficiently tested? Have they been tested thinking about the potential impacts on, say, historically marginalized communities? And what is the level of accountability that we're asking for in that level of transparency? This shift from, say, a trust and safety environment to a compliance environment is, I think, quite indicative of that. A lot of very large online platforms have completely wiped out their trust and safety teams, especially since things like the DSA have come into force. And so as the conversation moves towards compliance, are we looking at actually reduced transparency so that it is in that context rather than some of the measures that they took previously? And we also have to think about the push, and I wanted to come to your point on, say, the politicization of enforcement, which I think you were alluding to previously, in saying maybe the push from regulators or from those who are responsible for enforcement to use these technologies because they are the now technologies, because they are there, prior to understanding their potential impact, because that in itself also has a specific issue. So we also need to ask for that level of accountability from our regulatory bodies and those in the more political enforcement space to ensure that they are not also misusing their powers and ensuring a level of accountability from them as well.
So I think the Commission unveiled its first AI tool this week, so that's right up your alley. But I saw you nodding, Christina, to the point about using AI to detect misinformation and counter some of these trends. Yeah.
Indeed, because I believe that it's quite important that we also use technology to fight the spread of disinformation, and that's why we have been already for a while supporting research into this. For example, to develop technology that can detect if images have been taken out of context or repurposed, because indeed we have been seeing that still these old-style technologies are very much used. But now this research is also supporting new technologies that can detect deep fakes, that can detect voice generation. So I think it's very important that we are also investing in this technology. And also what we have been hearing from fact checkers is that this type of technology, or AI technology in general, can be very useful to make fact checking more efficient. So basically to detect if the same type of content is resurfacing in other languages, to help their work to be better scalable. And when it comes indeed to the figures, how much is currently AI generated or not, you also asked about that. I think it's indeed important to see that during the European elections, this was not so much. So basically only 4 or 5% of the disinformation fact-checked by EDMO has been AI generated. Of course, this needs to be an important point of attention, and we need to prepare also in a technological way, but at the same time, there is still also a lot of work to be done when it comes to old school disinformation.
Thank you, yeah. I'm going to address a question to you, Elsa. I see a couple of these questions are kind of on the same theme, basically the idea that is our regulation impeding us in Europe on the innovation front? And you taking a broad view across all OECD countries, do you have any thoughts about that, about the design of regulation and whether it's compatible with a robust innovation culture?
Yeah, so for this, I would take a step back and for all of us to reflect on what happened with social media since the beginning. So about 15, 18 years ago, we had this nice Facebook thing. We also thought it was a nice innovation to share content with our friends, and nobody predicted the way it was going to unfold. Now we have this new AI tool, and nobody can predict how it's going to be used in the future. For now, the biggest threats have not materialized in the information ecosystem. They might not. But what is important to understand is when there's innovation, sometimes we don't predict how it's going to be used. And that's the big difficulty between innovation and regulation. Regulation happens when we see that something is going in the wrong way. What I think when things go wrong is when this innovation is taken up by actors that have an enormous conflict of interest with financial returns and that are using innovation as a tool are using lobbying on regulation, against regulation, as a tool to avoid having to make, to make less money, to be very simple. Mm-hmm. And that's a bit where we are today, that we had a fabulous tool at the beginning, which were the social media, that has been shaped by financial incentives, which is, they are shaped so that I stay the longest possible on the platform so that we click on ads. It's very simple. So instead of being shaped by the public interest, they are shaped by financial interest. And then we get into heavy lobbying. Mm-hmm. And that's the question between innovation and regulation, is when something is being shaped the wrong way for the wrong reasons. And I think that's when regulation comes in. Yeah. I'd like to comment on one of the questions that was raised by Luminate at the beginning, because this conversation is very rich democracies centered to bring in the global south. Because if we think that we have problems of mis and disinformation, you have no idea how much it is of a problem in less developed countries where moderation is very, very small. And that's also something that we tend to underestimate for those countries, but also the influence that it has for our own countries as well. And this is something that we should also tackle all globally as an issue.
Indeed, yeah. I will come to you. You can touch on that question, but I do want to come up back on this question of innovation, which I saw is in several of these questions. I mean, here in Europe, we see the impact of regulation in the fact that Apple has not rolled out its AI tool, Meta has not rolled out its AI tool, Google has not rolled out its AI tool in Europe. Is that, how do you see that? Is that regulation really doing its job, or are we kind of missing out?
So I'd like to bring us back to a fundamental question of, when we have this conversation, there's a dichotomy created between innovation versus a rights-respecting environment. And I don't think that dichotomy should exist. Fundamentally, it shouldn't exist. There shouldn't be this conversation that innovation requires rights to be ignored in order for innovation to move ahead as much as it should. And that in itself brings us back to a bigger question of what we're talking about within the context that we live in and the economic environment. But fundamentally, if these companies are going to operate within the markets that we are discussing here, they have to respect the rights that are enshrined not only in the International Human Rights Framework, but the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. And similarly, the European Commission and the European institutions have a responsibility to protect those rights within the agreements and the treaties and the legislation that they put in place, and the EU member states agree to this as well. So I think then saying, okay, we have to allow these companies, for innovation reasons to just move ahead, and then we can think about the rights impacts as
but they're
an
making the
afterthought.
decision. They are making the decision not to roll it out preemptively to avoid the risk.
I think if we're in this context of saying, well, we are preemptively not doing this because the regulatory environment in Europe is so vast. Of course, we're talking about a very different regulatory environment in the US, for example.
Right.
So that in itself is a conversation that they are creating, or a narrative that they are creating, by saying we are preemptively not doing something because of the environment that you've put together. And as we were working on the development of the Digital Services Act and trying to make sure it was as strong as possible, this was coming up quite a lot. If you keep adding in things around fundamental rights, we're going to negate certain things. And I just don't think it's an argument that's acceptable, to be quite frank. And just to come to this point on thinking about how innovation works on a global level, and to connect to your point on the global south, I think we also should be very cautious in regards to thinking about the experiences of countries in the global majority. So, for example, mis and disinformation in the Kenyan elections, for example, was very rampant. But again, we can look to the civil society organizations who developed methods to be able to combat this and protect electoral integrity, and to use that lessons learned in the European context. I think often the narrative goes the other way around, that Europe is kind of, please look at our regulation, isn't it great, and we've got a regulatory framework, when there are lessons to be learned in the reverse also as well. But again, I think this innovation versus rights conversation undermines again the fact that even if they are innovating, they have a responsibility to respect rights in that context, even as they are innovating. So whether their financial incentives supersedes that is a fundamental question of how they're operating.
Go to you, Baibars, on that one, on the global south or global majority. You've had a lot of experience with fact-checking. When I was looking at this very closely, I remember a great lack of resources to do fact-checking on, especially on sort of along linguistic lines. In some countries with smaller languages, it was chronically understaffed. What has happened now? Have the major platforms employed more people to do fact-checking and content moderation along smaller languages or different language groups? What does it look like?
I mean, I wish I could say that that was the case, but unfortunately what we see is not just like, this large layoffs or like, different prioritization across those tech companies. It is a more like an automated workflow that those platforms are now suggesting their content moderation, takes place. And as we see that fact checkers working in countries like India, where we have a team of 45 fact checkers covering 6 Indian languages there, it is pretty much a challenge to identify fact-checkable claims and the narratives around those elections, because fact-checkers traditionally have been dependent on the tools that are provided by the platforms, and what we right now see is undermining those tools. For example, very recently, CrowdTangle was discontinued by Meta, being replaced by Meta Content Library, and it's a process that hopefully the product will catch up with CrowdTangle, but it just adds up additional toll on fact checkers to find most harmful, misleading content to act them on a very timely manner. So we are building logically accelerate to offer those fact checkers, practitioners, researchers, and industry experts to identify those main narratives that are fueled by various misinformation campaigns to cut down time to act more rapidly. Because what we see, especially in the global south, is due to the lack of checks and balances, the harm takes place very quickly. So the fact checkers are usually trying to find ways in which they can take a proactive stance on the misinformation, but unfortunately, the policies or the resources that the platforms are providing them with is not helping the case.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your insights here today and for coming to our event. I see that we're over time, so I'm going to move into closing remarks. I want to say thank you for the fascinating discussion today. Thanks for joining me up here. Great insights into the murky world of disinformation, integrity, and election interference. I'll just have a quick look at the results of our poll. Am I seeing the results of our poll? I'm not sure if I'm really seeing the results of our poll. How do I read it? Yeah. Is it coming? Is it back up here? Yeah, I'm not really getting which one is it. Yeah. Okay. The question was, yeah, I'm going to just skip that. Thank you all to the speakers for joining us and the audience for coming here today in person, and to our partner Luminate. The poll is up. Okay, it has come up. So here is the question. With the rise of deep fakes threatening election integrity, what is the most effective strategy to counter their spread? And the winner is a combination of tagging, fact-checking, and sanctions. There you have it. Answer to the question on everyone's mind. Thank you for that. Thank you to Luminate for making this event possible. We'd love to hear your feedback about this event. Feel free to email us about the event at live@politico.eu. And you can check out Politico's events website for the latest lineup on all our events happening this year at politico.eu/events. Thank you very much.